Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Warner. I'm president of the Culinary Historians of Chicago, and we have quite a delicious program for you tonight. Anyway, tonight we're going to get some bagel culture, and more than that, we're going to get um, a, a description of what Jewish food is. The reason we're doing this program is several months ago, Kathy told me about this cooking class, a bagel class that was being held at a synagogue in Hyde Park. And I thought, wow, I want to know more about bagels. So I signed up for it. And the person who presented the program, Dylan Maysick, was so interesting. And the bagels were so delicious. I believe we've given you a link to the bagel recipe in the notice that we sent with several recipes. But Dylan was so interesting. And Dylan, who does not come from a Jewish background, um, is so into Jewish cooking. He'll tell you all about that. He has a project called the Diaspora Dinner Project, and it's a Chicago-based series of dinners that explores the cuisines of the Jewish diaspora. Now, I'm Jewish myself, and I'm always trying to figure out what is Jewish food. There's I think about bagels, and when I was in Israel many years ago and going through the in Jerusalem, and I see these Arabs carrying around what look like bagels on sticks to sell. And I thought, well, those are bagels. I was eating in Jerusalem in Jewish restaurants, Israeli restaurants, and the food was Middle Eastern, hummus and everything. Also, um, I think about corned beef and, corned beef and cabbage or corned beef on rye. How Jewish is corned beef? But it's so Irish too. And also, well, in wonton soup, or is that kreplach in chicken soup? Anyway, I could go on about what makes Jewish food Jewish. Anyway, Dylan, could you take it away and explain to us what this is all about? And this is not chopped liver you're talking about. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for your kind words.
Oh, pardon me. One last thing too. If any questions you might have, please put them in chat and we'll get to them after Dylan is through speaking. So go ahead, Dylan. Sorry about that.
Great. Oh, no problem. Thank you so much. Thanks for your kind words. Thanks for having me, and thank you to everyone for making time for this evening. So just a little bit, I wanted to talk about my background a little
Dylan,
bit.
is that a picture of you there?
That is not a picture of me.
Oh, okay.
So we'll and it's part of my background and how I arrived where I am in the early stages of what I knew about Jewish food. So I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is not known as there's a single Reform congregation, and there's a little bit of a Chabad presence. My grandfathers were both pastors, so I did not grow up in Judaism. And I grew up in a community, like I was saying, where there's a very, very small Jewish presence. I knew I had one Jewish friend growing up, and one of his parents was not Jewish. They had a Christmas tree, and he was not really, he was ethnically Jewish, but not really immersed in Jewish culture or observance of Judaism. He didn't have a bar mitzvah. And the reason I had the picture that Scott was asking about is really a lot of my awareness of Jewish culture, to the extent that I had much of any, was like through Seinfeld. I loved Seinfeld as a kid. And I would I didn't really know much about like the very heavy Jewish influence and presence of Jewishness and Jewish culture and Jewish food within Seinfeld. But I was interested in the show. I really liked it. I'd never had a black and white cookie. I'd never had babka. I'd never had a marble rye. All these things that are very prominent in the show. I had had a big salad, but none of the other things. And so I was very had no knowledge of Jewish cuisine, and grew up eating like a very straightforward kind of Midwestern, both parents work, my mother trying to get food on the table very quickly after work. So I didn't know much about, I just kind of saw the dinner table as something between getting home and doing some homework. And um, when I moved to Chicago for college, a lot of my friends that I made in college were Jewish, all like Eastern European, like Ashkenazi families. And so I started to learn a little bit more about that. Like I had real properly boiled and baked bagels for the first time and had pastrami for the first time and um, had all these other food experiences. Like I'd never had lox, for example. And then later I moved to New York after college and had a lot more of that experience and then started dating my now wife, who is from a very large Ashkenazi family in Cincinnati. And I was the first person to intermarry in that family. I had a lot of everyone else had married someone who'd grown up Jewish, who was born Jewish, and um, I was felt very much like an outsider in a lot of ways, and I was curious about the food because I had a culinary background, and I was also curious about if I could learn to make the food, and I thought if I'm coming from outside, what better way to show respect and hopefully curry favor of future in-laws if I can learn how to make things that people want to eat. That would probably be a good way to go. And so I started asking my wife about some things like, oh, how did you make bagels? How did you make pastrami? What were the methods for this? How did you go about this? Like, did you have a recipe from your grandmother or something? And my wife was saying, oh, those were things that we bought. Those were mostly things that were purchased. People weren't making pastrami in the home, making brisket for the holidays, sure, but a lot of things that I was interested in were purchased. And so that was sort of an interesting thing to me, thinking about like deli, delicatessen, appetizing shops, and the preparations of these things in Eastern European Jewish culture. And around that same time, as I was meeting that extended family and also meeting some new friends that I had crossed paths with over the years, I met not just Israelis, but people that were from Sephardic backgrounds or Mizrahi Jewish backgrounds. I mean, people who were from food cultures that were very much Jewish, but didn't fit neatly in the box of what I'd understood Jewish cuisine to be previously. And so all that stuff was happening. We were getting married, and then shortly after, or in the lead up to that, sorry, I had a wholesale bakery. I was making mostly donuts, and it was kind of a young cook, got my own opportunity, had been a line cook before, but I never run a kitchen, was getting very burnt out and kind of losing my mind. And the business was afloat and I was keeping it afloat, but it had become really impersonal. I was just sort of running a factory and hiring people to do more and more things and spending more time with spreadsheets and emails and invoices and looking at the banking info and thinking about all this stuff that was really nothing to do with the kitchen. We had a 3-day honeymoon right after we got married, and that's the most time I'd had off in a couple of years. And I was like, wow, I got to be in the world again. I can't keep doing this. I'm gonna go crazy. I'm missing out on life. And so I stopped doing that and started thinking about, I just need to get an office job or something. And then within 2 months, we did a pop-up dinner as a Shabbat dinner just for fun, um, cooking some Jewish food I was curious about and had never made. And then it we filled the table. I was like, okay, maybe we'll sell tickets to it. And then we kept doing that and it kept growing. And so that's how we started the project Diaspora Dinners. Um, and kind of went from there. And what's really driven that and is in the name is like I'm interested in the food of the global Jewish diaspora, and I'm interested in kind of trying to arrive at a definition of Jewish food and what does it mean? Like what really is Jewish food or is not Jewish food? And what are the sort of threads that run through that, if any? So I know for sure, in my opinion, like Jerry Seinfeld definitely eating this black and white cookie. To me, that's like a textbook classic of Eastern European Jewish food. And I think like that's something I could really confidently say, like, okay, this feels like Jewish food. A bagel feels like Jewish food, without controversy. But I want to talk a little bit about defining a cuisine and trying to understand that. So here's a picture, and I just want to think about the contrast here. Um, this is a picture of a the seaside in Palermo. Looks like a nice place to be. I was thinking a lot about it, and I was thinking about kind of cuisine and the definition of cuisine being like defined by these parameters of what is grown in a place, what's produced in a place, what is the sort of the influence of the geography on food. And if you think of like the cuisine of Sicily, for example, there's not one sort of consistent Italian cuisine. You know that bread is important in much of it, pasta is important in much of it. You'll see dishes where Parmesan is prominent and mozzarella may be prominent, but there's not like a single answer to what is Italian cuisine, but you can kind of think like, okay, this is a seaside village. They're gonna have a lot of seafood. It's a warm climate. You're gonna see dishes where there's citrus is prominent. Hot peppers would grow well around that area. Olives would grow well around that area. But you're not going to probably see this dishes where they're heavy with like sage and butter that you see in northern Italy. I bring all that up to say when we look at a cuisine and we're trying to think about what is Jewish food, what is Jewish cuisine, this is a way that for many cultures, it sort of simplifies a definition where you can say on this dot on the map, this is what people are cooking, this is what people are eating based on what would grow well in that area, what can be foraged or caught, like catching fish in that area. And you could see that even in broad things like looking at, for example, um, it's just a little bit different compared with some of the other um, parts of the world where you'll see more crossovers. So for example, this is a map, a very rough map and a simplified map of the Silk Road trade route through many, many years. And you can kind of see in this one, like if you're starting going from China over into crossing into Eastern Europe, into North Africa, through the Middle East. That's when you start to see a lot of these cuisines were kind of established, where you'd say like this is a culture where there's a lot of bread, this is a culture where there's a lot of rice. I know there's like it's kind of I've read about those distinctions of like whether a culture is predominantly a rice culture or a bread culture. And you could see like once the sort of techniques of the cuisine have been a bit established. So you say like, oh, we tend to grill meats, where this other culture tends to boil them or cook them in an oven. We tend to bake bread instead of making rice. You have these sort of broad strokes of a cuisine. And then when you have something like this that introduces new ingredients, you start to see how those get absorbed into the forms. So in this case, like you have spices coming from China, and those would travel well and they get incorporated into all these dishes, but you're not necessarily seeing like tofu coming through, even though it had been made for many, many centuries. You're seeing like what would travel well and how does it fit into the form. They're not necessarily just being influenced into entirely new techniques. It's often that influence when a food culture has been established, it seems to show more in adding ingredients. And you see that throughout the world and how those forms are change. And then I wanted to talk about that. I was thinking about it a little bit in terms of if you would say like in this image of Palermo being this sort of dot on the map and what is the cuisine of Palermo. If we look at this is a map of contemporary Jewish populations throughout the world. These have shifted a lot over the past, like if we were to see a time lapse, generally speaking, historically, you have a huge Jewish population in centuries ago in Judea and what is now the region of the Middle East, like Israel, Palestine, and the surrounding areas. And since then, there's this diaspora that goes all over where they have historically very large populations of Jews in Eastern Europe. Jews were in the Iberian Peninsula and Spain and Portugal. They were kicked out in the late 15th century, end up in like North Africa. And you have Jewish populations today where there are still those populations in those areas, but a lot of that has ended up like Jews within the Middle East are primarily overwhelmingly in Israel. And you still have populations in North America between Israel and the United States. That's the majority of the world's Jewish population. If it's an estimated 15.2 million and we have nearly 13 million represented by just those two countries, with much smaller populations throughout the rest of the world. So you can see, I was referring to like a constellation of food, of cultures, and of communities in which Jewish people are living their lives and are cooking. And so there's inevitably an influence on that. And so you could say, where's Jewish food found? Short answer, anywhere that Jewish people are eating and cooking is where Jewish food is found. The roots of that, like ancient Jewish cooking being in that region of Judea. So there was like a lot of wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and honey. If that list is familiar, those are identified as the 7 species of Israel, which have a sort of like poetic and symbolic meaning. But those are things that grew well in that region. So you would see a cuisine that had some meat, some flatbreads, access to spices, and these fruits that would have been eaten right away. You're not going to see you're going to see things that could be eaten in hot weather. It's not like in Nordic regions where you have a lot of preservation of food for the winter, because it's a place where it's pretty warm most of the time. Um, then I want to just highlight that with to say, and again, looking at that map, while there is that root of ancient Jewish food and all of that, there's not a monolithic, unified sense of food, or of Jewish food or Jewish food culture. Much of, especially within North America, what people talk about as being Jewish food is often, I imagine, if you were to say, ask people on the street, what is a Jewish food? They would be likely to say like bagels and lox, challah, pastrami, these things are sort of the greatest hits, which are mostly of Eastern European Jewish origin. And that's definitely relevant to Jewish food culture, but it doesn't represent the entirety of it. It's, I think, partly because those populations coming to America arrived a bit earlier. There were a lot of German Jews that arrived, especially, and assimilated more quickly into the culture, especially like in New York, and then supported the assimilation of a lot of Jews from Eastern Europe later. And so there was a big influence with the Lower East Side being a very romanticized Jewish food culture. But we also have Sephardic Jews and the food that they cooked throughout North Africa, made with tagines, really heavily seasoned food, spice blends like Ras el Hanout, Baharat, and this influence of in which there's a lot of influence of the countries in which they lived. So like Sephardic food, you can see a lot of overlap with Moroccan cuisine, for example. Um, and there are historic populations that still have a very significant food culture, even though the population has um, largely left that area. So I know, for example, there's a point in which there are a lot of Jews of Iraqi origin, but and there was a point where I've read that Baghdad was about a quarter Jewish at one point. Now it's like single digits of the Jews that remain living in Iraq. So, but there's still, that food is alive and well. I have a friend that lives down the street from me, and his family was Iraqi Jewish going back many generations. None of them live there anymore, but the food culture is alive and well. We're going to make dinner with him in a few weeks. So even though that food and that community exist entirely in diaspora, that food is living on, and he's taught his son to make it, and hopefully his sons will like that and learn to make it as well. And the one thing that I really want to talk about with that is, so there is these food cultures are existing in dialogue um, with wherever they're living. So you would see, and it gets a little bit tricky because then we start to talk about credit for recipes and sort of ownership of food. Um, and I think that gets to be very difficult, but I don't want to shy away from that in trying to understand the influence of cultures on one another, and who claims ownership and all of that. And so like one thing I wanted to look at is I think I have a few images here. Um, so this is a falafel sandwich. I don't think, to me, this is not an appealing falafel sandwich to me personally. I think it looks like it's made on multi-grain bread. And I picked that picture not because it looks appetizing, because to be honest, it does not look appetizing to me, but because I wanted falafel has become is so ubiquitous, and it's very hard to trace a single origin from that. And I don't know that that would even really be possible, because if the way I've often thought about it is people that have in a similar region with similar weather, similar ingredients in the same time period, it doesn't seem to me like a giant stretch to imagine that people would arrive independently at similar or identical approaches to preparing food. So for example, falafel, there's a presence of falafel going very far back in Egypt, in Turkey, in any Middle Eastern country that you can name. There's been falafel. Sometimes it's more fava beans. Sometimes what's more popular in the US is chickpea based. The recipes can vary as far as how they're seasoned, how they're served. Sometimes a falafel sandwich is in a pocket pita. Sometimes it's wrapped up in like laffa bread. Unfortunately, in this case, it's between two slices of what appears to be multigrain bread with raw red onion, and I don't what might even be mayonnaise. I apologize to anyone that's been offended by this crime of a sandwich, but I wanted to talk about it to say this in looking at ownership of food and acknowledgement and credit. What I really want to talk about and highlight is to say some things, in my opinion, are extremely hard to pin down. And I would just say, I think a lot of people made falafel in a lot of parts of the world at the same time, from what I know of it. And then we have some other things that are in contrast to this. So this is something I've had and I've made and I just love. It's called Arise. It's Arayes. Um, this is a dish that I had this in Jaffa um, with a friend who lives in Tel Aviv. We were eating throughout Jaffa. He is a food historian and has a touring company. He's a very educated person who's lived in and around the general broader area of Tel Aviv for his entire life. And he told me immediately, we're going to go get food at this Palestinian place I'm very fond of. And they've started making this recipe recently, and I just love it. And we ate a lot of it, even though we'd already eaten way too much that day. And all that to say, he highlighted very emphatically before we took a bite to say, this is a Palestinian dish. It's made by a Palestinian business with Palestinian chefs. And I have seen other times where this appears with no acknowledgement on menus of restaurants in the US that identify as Israeli restaurants. And I personally would really urge anyone that's cooking in that way to give credit where credit's due. Where it's if we can know of an origin of a dish and we have the ability to acknowledge that, I think that's important. And it's not always the case. So like falafel, I think it's very hard to identify. A rice, from what I've heard from people that live in the region, was clearly Palestinian. This is sabich, which if you've never had it, is really good. It's fried eggplant. It's got tahina, boiled eggs. It's in a pita, and it's got, if you see some of that orange stuff, that's called amba. If you've never had it, it's a pickled mango condiment with a fenugreek, and it has like a real funk to it. It is in small quantities, unbelievably delicious. In big quantities, totally overpowering and hard to eat. Um, but with a little bit of that on there on a sandwich, I think that's just great. That's an Iraqi dish, and amba is a very often associated with Iraq. I read that when Saddam Hussein was found and he was living like he'd obviously had palaces, and when he was in hiding, he had like a mini fridge, like in a college dorm, and he had amba. So that's a good indicator to me of how fond someone would be of something if their life has been shrunk down so much and they're living in hiding, that he still wanted his amba, so he was very fond of it. Um, this is can really be traced back to be an Iraqi Jewish dish often eaten for breakfast. Um, and again, I think it's very important when we can trace these things back to say, okay, this is an Iraqi dish. This is an Iraqi Jewish dish. This is a Palestinian dish. This one is kind of everybody's, it seems, like falafel. Um, and to really kind of give credit and not just appropriate it. And especially if we're trying to define what is Jewish food, I think there's something really cool to be able to say, like, sabich is a Jewish food, and a rice is something that can be made by Jews, eaten by Jews, enjoyed by Jews, of course, but it's I think everybody should be able to cook and eat everything that they want to do that. But when we can give credit, I think it's important to do so. Um, I had an interesting, and I'll be done about on the topic of appropriation and credit shortly, I promise. But I read something recently, a couple years back. I'm not going to name the group, but there's a very prominent Chicago restaurant group that was opening a restaurant that had a lot of Indian dishes in it. And the owner of that restaurant group is not Indian. And none of the opening chef was not Indian. And I saw the job listing for a culinary consultant that was offering $25 an hour for a short-term job to teach all the skills of Indian cooking. And I just found that very I felt a bit gross where they didn't know how to make the food, and rather than they could have partnered with someone who knew how to make that food and even given them ownership if they wanted. I think it would be a good gesture, but they were sort of, I felt almost like mining something to say, like, we're going to extract whatever knowledge you have and then send you on your way after we paid you $25 an hour. If they were there for 40 hours, they'd pay them $1,000 to teach them how to make what they'll make millions in revenue on over the years. So it felt, yeah, like a mine almost of extracting knowledge and then sort of leaving, and leaving that person behind. Where I would say, at its best, and what I'd really like to be doing in cooking Middle Eastern food moving forward is to have collaborations where if that was this extraction process like mining, I'm more interested in sort of like musicians jamming and what would be like, there's jazz standards or blues. There are very few basic structures. There's some certain structures that have been used many times, but people are expanding upon those standards and putting their own stamp on it while also understanding where it comes from. And I think that the respect of that and the collaborative spirit of that is a real game changer, in my opinion. Um, I want to talk a little bit now that I'm done. So rant over. Sorry about that. So what what is Jewish food in a sort of umbrella sense, and what I'm interested in defining that. So not all Jews, of course, keep kosher. Many people are in some sort of middle ground on that, and many don't keep kosher at all, and some are very, very strict. To anyone that's not familiar, so the kosher laws, for food to be kosher, at its most basic, there's no pork and no shellfish, and certain animals that are not allowed, not considered kosher. I've got a diagram here. So a cow chews its cud and has split hooves. Pigs, rabbits, and kangaroos, they don't do that. They're not kosher. Domesticated species, chicken, duck, and turkey. Scavenger species you don't want to eat. Um, Trout, tuna, salmon, they all have fins and scales. Crustaceans don't, and you don't eat meat and dairy together. Um, there are also rules about, yeah, not eating meat and dairy together, and then there's something called parve, which means it's neither milk nor meat. So an onion or lettuce, for example, would be parve, but you also have certain things that are surprisingly to me, when I did not grow up Jewish, as I've said, and so certain things surprise me, that like a lox bagel is totally fine. That could be considered kosher, because fish is considered neither milk nor meat. The reasoning behind that, from what I've read, which I found interesting, is a lot of rabbis who are asked about these things, and the commentary that made a lot of rules that people live by historically. The thought was, you put the phrases to like sort of put a fence around something. So if you say, what I really, really don't want to happen, because milk and meat should not be cooked together, which is based on this verse in Torah where it says that you wouldn't to not boil a calf in its mother's milk. And so that was interpreted like, okay, the beef of a calf and its mother's milk, that should not be done. And so the rabbis would sometimes say to put a fence around something to say, okay, well, if that is what's very important to us, we want to make sure that no one even gets close to that. So if we don't want beef and if we don't want to have beef and milk together, let's also take out poultry just so nobody gets confused. And so we keep a very wide fence around this very important rule by actually making it more strict than it has to be, so that if there's any confusion, nobody accidentally gets confused and messes it up. For Passover law and kosher rules, that is also a thing, where it's grains that are referred to as kitniot, things like corn and rice, were historically Sephardic Jews would eat them. So Jews like from the area of like North Africa who'd come from Spain, many of them would eat that during Passover. But there were Jews, I believe, French rabbis many centuries ago that ruled to not eat any of that stuff with the idea that it could get confused with other grains and you could accidentally be eating flour and wheat on Passover, which you're not supposed to be doing. So like, let's just ban the corn, let's ban the rice, let's get every grain out of there, and you're just eating matzah so that it's you're not accidentally eating something you're not supposed to be eating.
Oh,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just interject for a second. Years
Sure.
ago, I did an article about the myths of kosher.
Yeah.
I interviewed an Orthodox rabbi, and I asked him, is it about health, keeping kosher? He said, no. And it's what you're talking about. It's these traditions or these rules. He said, kosher means more than food. It means about observing God and how you treat people. So anyway, I just wanted to interject that, but kosher food is not necessarily, it's kosher means it's healthier.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big myth, that it's helpful to know that the difference between kosher and health. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, you see at times kosher law is very, very strict. Like I've been in homes where there was a separation of completely everything, in a synagogue where there was essentially two kitchens fully functional and you just never mix between the two, a dairy kitchen and a meat kitchen. I think that's what really shows up in Jewish food now and informs that to me is um, kosher style. And many delis are this way, and many successful restaurants are this way. And my home, we eat this way generally, and it means to not have milk and meat in the same dish. So even if it was like chicken parmesan would not be considered kosher style, but someone might have a piece of cheesecake after eating beef, but not in the same meal or not on the same plate or in the same dish. So that's a very common way of cooking. So on that note, um, so I think that yeah, the sense of kashrut, kosher really informs things. But the other thing that I think really informs Jewish food now and I think always will is the ritual and symbolism of holiday foods. So you see on Hanukkah, people cook oily foods. Historically, Eastern European Jewish cooking, a lot of times that would be potato pancakes, latkes, served with sour cream and or applesauce. People have strong opinions about that. Or making or buying donuts, sufganiyot, jelly donuts. Those are, you commemorate the miracle of the oil lasting in the temple for 8 days beyond all expectation by cooking oily foods. And that kind of structure and form really makes me feel like these traditions can really live forever because they can evolve with the times. The Jewish food, in this case, it's about a form and it's about a structure and a symbolic meaning. The same thing with Rosh Hashanah being the head of the year, the Jewish New Year. There's things with heads, like the head of a fish. That's not as common now on a lot of people's plates, but round stuff still is. to symbolize something being endless. So round challah is probably forever. And I think things that we don't even know yet, techniques of cooking or ingredients, that it'll just keep going as people continue to explore to say, okay, for Yom Kippur, what will I eat before I fast and what will I eat after? What's going to help me have a good fast later and what's going to be enjoyable for me to break the fast when I'm done. Historically, a lot of people have like a bagel brunch, even though it's nighttime. You haven't eaten anything all day, so I guess you might as well start with breakfast. But I think that there's room in that form to say what's conducive to fasting, what's nice to eat when you're done fasting. Um, and I think that that's really one of the other things that's the heart of Jewish food. I think that kashrut, whether people are strictly kosher or don't think about it at all, there's a mindfulness to it that's very important. I saw a friend of a friend posted something on Instagram, and it was a bacon cheeseburger on 2 pieces of matzah on Passover. And they said, like, this is my Judaism. And I just really, it really, really struck me in a way to say, if matzah is the bread of affliction, if we commemorate Pesach, Passover with the and remembering liberation and the bread of affliction and having these memories of um, suffering and injustice of the past and try to understand how that applies to the modern day and the world we live in now, and that person didn't care particularly about keeping kosher, but they were very strict about the matzah. That was poetically perfect to me, whether or not I would be eating that, but it was really cool to see the ways in which people were living something that was meaningful to them within frameworks that someone else would be maybe horrified by. Um, and again, that thinking about those forms and the symbols and living out those symbols, I just found it really, really beautiful and truly moving to see how those structures within Jewish food can really live forever. My favorite holiday, and I do view it as that, in Judaism, Shabbat, which starts at sunset Friday and goes till sunset Saturday, is every week, commemorating the creation of the world and that day of rest. And we mark that historically, and the most observant Jews would not really do much of anything on Shabbat, not light a flame to cook, not drive. And so you have to do all this preparation for Shabbat, not just having challah on the table for dinner and the wine for the rituals, but to the next day have like a warm meal for lunch without cooking. And I think that there's something very powerful in Shabbat, not just in those cholents, these like slow braised stews that people would eat, and there's many ways to approach that. People could use a slow cooker now. It's a different era from when people would cook in the dying embers of a communal oven. But there's something about the mindfulness practice of saying, I'm going to try to not really work today. I'm going to try to make sure we have something beautiful and joyful and comforting without doing any of that today. And I think that there's the benefit to that, and to the extent to which there's meaning and joy within Jewish food, I think that's what will persist, and that's what's, to me, most important and feels the most Jewish. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Trafe. This is bacon, obviously. And when Tablet Magazine, which is, if you're not familiar, they have been around many, many years and do cover contemporary Jewish culture and politics. And one thing they did recently, a few years back, it was very interesting, was they made it compile a list of the 100 most Jewish foods. There are certain things that were obvious that you'd see on there. I was no surprise to see brisket or bagels or things like that. But bacon was one of them. And what they said was that it was such a symbolic transgression, and such a tempting thing, even for people who, if people have begun to keep kosher but didn't used to, for example, that bacon was this representation of that. And you'll see that in delis. I know like Steingold's, for example, has bacon on their sandwiches. I'm sure there are others where that's happening as this sort of, I think if you want to make something appealing and interesting, you have to say you can't have it, and then people will get pretty excited about it. And just so obviously that's not everyone, but we saw that even in the Reform movement, when Reform Judaism was started and was rising to prominence. There was a party in the 1800s where they had the Trafe banquet and they served all this shellfish and stuff. as they were sort of assimilating into broader American society while maintaining the aspects of their Judaism that felt important to them. You see that also like in a Reuben sandwich, things like that. So there's all kinds of Reuben combining milk and meat, of course. It doesn't have treif inherently. It's not, and everything in a Reuben is permissible to eat under Jewish law, but the combination of draping the cheese, melting the cheese over the corned beef is it makes it something that someone is not supposed to be eating under like religious Jewish law. So I want to talk about the recent past, what I believe to be a decline in Jewish food, and then I want to talk about the future of Jewish food. So it's going to sound a little bit negative, and then I kind of want to go toward what I feel is much more positive. This is a picture of a giant bagel operation. So if you know like Lender Bagels, I believe that was the family they were the first ones to use the bagel maker. So historically, bagels were made by highly skilled workers. It was a really respected union job. It paid well. It was not easy, but it was a really good job, and a lot of people wanted those jobs. When they started producing bagels with this kind of machinery, it went from a highly skilled job that took a lot of people and a lot of uh, just not a know-how, and it went into something that was very mechanized. These bagels are supposed to be mixed, a very stiff dough. It's very hard to mix bagels. Um, it's very high gluten content. It's hard to work with the dough. They need to be rolled out, typically rolled out around your hand, like rolled into a rope, coiled around the hand, rolled flat to make a seam onto the next one, then boiled and baked. To make a good bagel takes a lot of time, a lot of space, a lot of effort. What people discovered once they made a mechanized bagel maker was that unskilled workers, and very few of them, could make a giant amount of bagels if you were to just kind of have this basically like a pasta extruder popping out round dough balls, punching a hole in them, skipping the boiling process, and then baking them in these giant ovens. And what you have, you can see on this, they look very uniform. They have almost no hole in the bagel, and they have no real sheen to them because they weren't boiled. So they end up not being as chewy. I mean, I don't have to go on and on about why a bagel from a large corporation that can sit on a shelf for 2 weeks, why those are not particularly good. But I'm sure we've all had them. If you haven't, that's great. But um, so what we saw, I think, broadly in food for decades, kind of in the middle of the 20th century, going toward the late 20th century, was bounty and convenience and a decline in craft. And the bagels really exemplified that. There's a book that I would highly recommend for anyone that's interested in Jewish food. It was published in 2009 by the Canadian writer David Sachs. He wrote a book called Save the Deli, and he'd spent a few years traveling around to delis and talking with people, the owners and operators, and getting a sense of the state of the deli in North America. And what he found was pretty dire. A lot of places were closing. Some places has tried to scale and open a place in Vegas, or just try to grow and take every financial opportunity they had to to try and survive. I think there were a lot, and most of these delis at that time, many of them were closing. Anyone who lived in a major city with a significant Jewish population would have definitely seen that from like say 1970 to 2010. Generally, delis were closing at a rate that was a lot faster than they were opening. And I think there were a lot of reasons for that. There were changes in dining trends. People were afraid of fat and cholesterol. So the giant towering sandwich became less appealing. Suburbanization, where what had once been tight-knit communities that were very walkable were suddenly sprawling, and so people weren't stopping by the same places all the time with the same regularity. And new opportunities, which is not altogether negative. I think for many deli owners, their children grew up, went to college, and ended up in other occupations and had more opportunities than their parents had, and didn't want to run a deli. And then food costs is a huge one and has really, when we think of Jewish food, if we think of it as towering sandwiches, which it is certainly not just that, but to run a deli at this point is very hard because it's a towering sandwich. It's basically multiple pounds of beef between two little slices of bread. If you serve that in a steakhouse, somebody also orders cocktails or a bottle of wine. They buy all this other high margin stuff like potatoes, and they leave happy spending way more than they would at a deli because of the ambiance and all that. The deli needs to charge $30 for a sandwich, and people think it's very, very expensive, but then they expect the sandwich to be very large. So it's a very hard game to win. And we've seen some challenges with that throughout our city as we kind of look to the current state. And I said I would get more positive, and I am. I want to talk about Chicago just because that's where I am and where I think many of you are. We saw, for example, Steingold's open. I think that was 2018. And there's a lot of other people that are opening places, and Steingold's is opening and just opened something new, and I think they're opening another new thing. But we've seen some places that really had a struggle, like Jeff and Jude's, which I thought was excellent, but they said they lost money on every pastrami sandwich they sold. It just couldn't be made efficiently enough and priced right for everything to work. And they tried to make a model where there was a loss leader, and it was unfortunately not viable long term. It was RIP. It was a great restaurant. I really liked it. Um, but we can see, yeah, that in among Jewish food, again, it's not just deli. So Galit, the Israeli restaurant, has a Michelin star. They've been open, I think, almost 5 years now, about 5 years, and seem to be doing very well. I really enjoyed the food. I was very impressed by it. And that's another wave of restaurants and Jewish food that we was largely absent in the sort of fine dining um, type of food, as say Middle East, Israeli, Jewish fine dining. Zahav opened in Philadelphia in I think 2008, and Zach Engel, who's the chef owner of Galit, he's an alum of there, and he opened a place in New Orleans with Alon Shaya that was also uh, as an alum of Galit. So it's across multiple cities, these projects that are kind of all off this one branch. And I feel like the present feels pretty good for Jewish food, where we're seeing new delis opening. And I think that looking to the future, I think that's one thing I hope that we'll keep seeing. And when I think about what the future looks like, and my predictions for that, I think would be everything old is new again. I think craft will soar to new heights as far as like I showed that like sad picture of the bagel of all the mass produced bagels where now we have people are willing to pay a lot more for a bagel. I know like Zaitlin's is doing a great job at all the farmers markets, and the bagels are not cheap. And I don't think they should be. They're made by hand and they taste really good. They're not being made on a conveyor belt by one person making thousands a day and not boiling them or anything. They're really well made, and it takes a long time. I think it really earns its price. Um, and we're seeing the return of a lot of lost foodways. So like I'll see if I have a picture on that. The gefilte. Oh, these are Zeitlin's bagels, by the way. You can see the nice form to them, that these are clearly handmade. They're all a little bit unique, and they're very well boiled and baked. Um, and we can see like gefilte, for example, in New York, they're cooking old school Ashkenazi food, making like blueberry soups and things that I'd not even known to have been in the canon of Jewish food. And it's really cool to see turning back and also moving forward to say, what did this used to be? What do we know now? And how can we make this Jewish food feel alive and contemporary, and like sourcing sustainable seafood to make their own gefilte fish? It's really cool. And it's just really cool to see something that I had only ever seen in a jar for the most part to be made and treated with such respect and love is really cool. The other thing,
Oh, excuse me. What is that that's on the screen right
those
now?
are Hamantaschen.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say on the note of the Hamantaschen, um, I really think that as this Jewish cuisine continues to move forward, as long as these forms are there, I think we'll always be fine in having uh Jewish foodways be preserved and feel vibrant and alive. Hamantaschen, me for those who don't know, it's they're making fun of Haman, who wanted to kill the Jews, and Esther heroically was responsible for making sure that didn't happen. And that was 2,500 years ago, and people are still laughing at this guy's ears or his hat, depending on who you talk to, um, and making new flavors every year. So the form and the poetry are there, and the things can keep moving with that. So Gefilte, same thing. They're really drawing from the past while doing things in a way that feels very of the moment. Which that deep knowledge of the past is vital to be able to do that in a way that feels respectful and really carries that lineage onward. But to let the new in, I think is really cool too. On that note, the other thing that I think we're going to see is a lot more global influence. This is a plate from Shalom, Japan. The chef, I believe his name is Aaron Israel. He's Jewish, his wife is Japanese, and they started this restaurant together in Brooklyn. It's been around for quite a while. You can see like matzo ball ramen and the challah, which on the side, I think it's a miso spread. Um, but to see this global influence where the technique, the narrative thread, it's all coming through, but we're seeing influence from outside, but of like say Ashkenazi tradition, but in a way that's I think fusion has sometimes been treated like a four-letter word. Um, and I think there have been some examples where it was a bit weird, as sort of aren't I clever approaches to cooking. But when we see something like this, Kimski in Bridgeport, which I just love, nothing to do with Jewish food, but where the Marzuski family being one parent being Polish and one being Korean, and how they were able to just organically mix those foods into something that's really beautiful and personal and doesn't feel forced or it's not contrived. It's just actually how people were cooking and eating, and it's really beautiful to see. The last thing I think, as far as the future of Jewish food, is I think that kosher is going to be, I think, actually less significant over time, because I would imagine the future is just going to be more and more plant-based as plant-based alternatives get better and better. Um, and I think raising and slaughtering animals is going to start to feel like kind of anachronistic, I would imagine, thinking 50 years ahead or so. And so much of kosher, apart from for Passover, almost all the kosher law refers to animal products and what you can and can't eat and what can and can't be mixed. So I think that more stuff will be open to a broader audience because it'll be easier to keep kosher for those who value it. Um, so on to kind of final thought here, because it's a bit all over the place as far as what feels like it is and isn't Jewish food. I was reminded of the old Supreme Court case of an obscenity trial where Potter Stewart was asked to define obscenity or pornography, and he said, "I know it when I see it," and I guess that's sometimes the best answer. In what feels like Jewish food, it does feel like I know it when I see it. Chinese food feels Jewish, but only on Christmas. Some things feel Jewish all the time. Um, and it's a question to kind of constantly reevaluate and return to. So thank you.
Thank you. We're going to get into the chat questions right away. I just want to add a little something. I mentioned that about the Orthodox rabbi that I interviewed years ago. The reason I interviewed him, I'm a food writer, but I was also working for a medical association. And we got a call from, and I was editor of their magazine, and I got a call from a rabbi. He wanted somebody to come down. He did kosher certification for companies. He wanted somebody to come down to the Hyatt downtown to talk to him about the kosher food that they served in their kosher restaurant, Misada, which is an Israeli word for restaurant. And he said the reason he wants doctors to know about the kosher food is because they can send their patients there who are lactose intolerant. I thought that was very interesting. And then I thought this is an interesting story, which I eventually wrote the story about the place for the Tribune. Coming in to manage that restaurant was Alon Ben-Gurion, the grandson of David Ben-Gurion, the first president of Israel. And I did some stories about the restaurant. And one thing was that it was an all kosher restaurant. And one night a week, they would have ethnic food. One night a week would be Italian, one night a week would be Chinese, and so on and so on. And it was all kosher. They didn't even tell people it was a kosher restaurant, but it was kosher. So that's what is kosher food. I up till then I thought kosher meant Jewish food. So it's like you're saying, you know it when you see it, but and could you tell a little bit about what you offer in your diaspora dinners? Your bagel class was so interesting too. And even though you say how difficult it is, for getting the skilled workers, the way you taught the class, like we too can do it at home, and they are so delicious. But anyway, what do you do at a diaspora dinners? And can you talk so people can find out more about it? And then we'll answer the chat questions.
Yeah, so we started as a pop-up dinner series, and then we've expanded to kind of organically as people were interested in different workshops or things like that. So that's been most of what I've done has been pop-up dinners, catering, and then looking at at workshops based on what people were interested in doing. So sometimes someone wants to learn about something and I'll see if I can figure it out and to offer it. And then sometimes I'll just post a class, like a challah baking class, for example. I have a MailChimp, so on diasporadinners.com, somebody can sign up for the MailChimp, and I'll send out updates when there's stuff coming up.
And your website really explains everything. That was diasporadinners.com.
Yep.
Yeah, and that just explains everything. So anyway, yeah, Kathy, you want to take any of the chat questions?
Do you include the Jewish group in Africa that claims to be the lost tribe, which may have been answered by somebody else, but I'll tell you what their answer was, so in case there's an issue. The Ethiopian Jewish community is legitimate, and many have moved to Israel.
Oh,
I don't know
yeah.
if that-
I don't yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. Yeah, I've always understood that there was an Ethiopian Jewish community, many of whom have since left Ethiopia.
On that, the falafel sandwich that you didn't particularly like, the one that was on the multigrain bread,
Yeah.
Penelope suggested that her money would go that it was yogurt, what the white stuff might have been.
I hope so, yeah. I prefer that.
Okay. We have several lengthy comment questions from this guy, but we'll just figure it out. In discussing dishes found within the Mediterranean, you identified some specifically as being from modern nation states, Iraq, Turkey, etc. Do you think these modern boundaries have affected how you've thought about the identities of certain dishes?
I would imagine that it has had an impact, but I guess because I don't know what I don't know. So if there's a source that if I were to read about a source where I could get a bit more of a historical context and a bit of a more nuanced portrait of the historical origin of those dishes and food cultures and the many cultures that comprise something that's been put into a modern border. I'd be definitely interested in that, but I can't really speak to I can't really speak to what I don't know. So sure, I'm sure it's impacted me. I just can't say quite how until I've had a chance to dig deeper on that. I'd welcome any reading that anyone wants to send me on that or
we
anything.
were sort of discussing this last night when we met initially, because there are regional dishes that
Mhm.
cross borders.
Yeah.
So political borders are arbitrary for whatever reason.
Mhm.
But each one will claim it's theirs, when in fact it's a regional dish shared by many cultures. I mean, we were talking about that last night. I think that's
Yeah,
similar,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are cases where you can see who has who has credit and you see a clear origin or something, and I think that's a bit rare, but in the times that we can know that, I always want to know that and highlight that if I'm able. Yep. Sorry, my children have appeared. Guys, I'm talking to some people right now. You can say hi if you want, but then we're gonna say goodnight, okay?
Lovely
Sorry about
kids.
that.
No, it's
Okay.
life.
I got rock.
They make a nice side dish for your program.
I got rock.
Yeah, you found some rocks, Dovey. All right. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so there's a comment here on
Yeah, from Carrie, he said, I read a reliable source that said there's a bacteria that cross between milk and meat via the wooden bowls they I guess had been served and can be harmful. Also, the kinds of meat was because the forbidden animals require not being nomadic.
oh, yeah, I didn't know that part, that they would require not being nomadic. That's really interesting. Um, and then yeah, regarding wooden bowls, I did know about like wooden bowls and certain I know like ceramic as well, that when certain things have touched that, they can't be koshered again, where like metal, for example, can be koshered again because it doesn't absorb. I wonder if that has something to do with that.
Do we have another question?
Yep.
Dishes among Ashkenazi Jews, in some sense, have been enabled to develop distinctly because of the enforced ghettoization of the Jewish community, like in the Pale of Settlement. In regions that have seen much greater integration between Jews and Goyim, such as the Bukharian Jewish community, how do you understand regional versus religious categorizations of food? Do you think identifying particular dishes as specifically Jewish can risk imposing historical revisionism, wherein all Jews existed separately from their surrounding communities, universalizing the prototypical experiences of Ashkenazi? Sorry,
So there's a
big
couple things in
question.
there. I do think there is, and I want to start with this because it feels like the highest priority to me, to say I don't ever want to overextend to say something is solely a Jewish dish. I think that is really, whether referring to food that's in the Middle East today or anything throughout history, I always want to be very mindful of that, to say there are many dishes that were, say, um, existed across Jewish cultures and the surrounding non-Jewish culture, and which they belong to both of those cultures. They're not specifically Jewish. So, like, if we were to talk about, for example, um, Jewish food that was made historically by Mizrahi Jews, or Jewish food that was cooked in what is now Yemen, we, for example, we can talk about that those Jews would cook with hawaj, the spice blend hawaj, and that hawaj to me would be Jewish food, but it's not exclusively Jewish food. It belongs to whoever has historically cooked with hawaj. It's not one or the other. It's all the above. Um, I that was a really interesting and a good point that at the end there, that the problem of universalizing the prototypical experiences of Ashkenazim. And then I think hopefully I've answered that. Okay. Happy to
Okay,
talk
and
more, of course. But
then there was a comment from Carrie. Oh, I thought even mass-produced bagels were boiled. That was a surprise for him.
so there definitely are some that are boiled. Like I know my local grocery store is Harvest Time. We've had there are bagels there that are like a mass-produced bagel that says on the package it's boiled. I've had others where I could tell it definitely wasn't. So it's all possible. I think there are decent mass-produced bagels in some cases even. But there was a trend. Shh, Sylvie, sorry. There was a trend in which it was getting more and more streamlined, and at least for some companies, that process was getting was being skipped.
Okay, and Penelope added the comment about the great Hamantashen Latke debate held each fall at the University of Chicago as something people should consider looking for. Now we have another rather extensive question. The foods you've identified as signaling the future of Jewish food in the U.S. are all associated with Ashkenazim.
Sylvia, be
you-
quiet, please.
That's
Sorry.
okay, I understand. No, I understand your situation. Do you see a future in the U.S. for Sephardic specific foods? As someone from a non-Jewish background and married to an Ashkenazi woman, how do you understand your relationship to providing diaspora meals which draw from other Jewish culinary traditions, particularly because you mentioned that you are charged for these meals? Do you think Ashkenazi Jews have a responsibility to advance other Jewish cuisines? And if so, how do you envision being carried out without usurping the position of the cultural producers actually from these communities? Maybe Nadir, you should come here and do a talk, and you could explain all of your thoughts, because these are quite extensive.
So yeah, in looking at the future, I mean, I think in looking at the future of Jewish cuisine, which I was talking about that, yeah, I was thinking in a sort of Ashkenormative mentality and highlighting deli and bagels. But I do think the future is increasingly plant-based. That seems to be the trajectory we're on. So in a broad food trend way, I think that a lot of Sephardic and Mizrahi foods would have a more prominent position in the foods that are cooked and are popular in restaurants, or as recipes that people are making for themselves and things like that. I think that just broadly, we're going to see more and more specific niche restaurants. When I say niche, to refer to like a lot of delis historically were very broad and kind of broadly Eastern European Jewish menus, and then like the early examples of restaurants that were cooking like Israeli food, for example, in the US were sort of broadly Israeli. I think we're going to see more things that get more specific to say like this is Yemeni Jewish food, this is Moroccan Jewish food, and things like that. I think we'll see that increase over time. I certainly hope so.
Or what about New York Jewish food too? That's a whole different ballgame, right?
I mean, it's a whole different thing, and it's what many people associate with Jewish food, I think, in North America, at least have historically. That's been treated as like the main thing. So it does really look at things through an Ashkenazi lens, and I think that's changing, and I would hope it continues to change. As far as cooking those foods and charging for meals that are from those food cultures, one thing I've done and I've been very grateful to have the opportunity to do and to be get to be in dialogue with those people is a lot of the menu development has happened with friends who have those backgrounds, and getting to work with them. As far as taking the place of what would be I think the word was usurping the position of cultural producers actually from those communities. I would not want to do that if I saw an instance where I thought I was on the cusp of doing that. I would back away from it. It's just something I've not seen much of in those food options being offered in Chicago, where I thought someone was going to my dinner or someone from that community. If I could amplify the sort of the signal of promoting some of that for someone who wanted to do that, I would be really happy to do so.
By the way, there was, did you see the deli exhibit at the Holocaust Museum?
I did, yeah. Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Scott and I were fortunate to go to a program early on where they had Manny's, they had a number of highly influential and highly involved people in Jewish food. And Manny's was one of them. And something came up, and the question that was asked was, what is the cost of food in your place? And everybody kind of gave a few numbers, and then the people from Manny's said 50%.
Hmm.
And there was just a stunned, I mean, these were people who, been in cooperation for many years, and there was a stunned silence when they heard that.
Yeah.
Because that's probably what, like, that deli that went out of business, what they were dealing
Mm.
with. Because you're going to make things and do it right, it's quite expensive.
Yeah. And especially if it's like such a beef centric menu, it's going to make it, whether it's beef or fish or both, like any of that, it's going to be a challenging thing.
And the author that you mentioned, Save the Deli,
Yes.
I did see him when he came through Chicago when he was talking about his book. And another thing, there was a program at Manny's related to it. One of the things that was also surprising and outstanding with Manny's was they make their own gefilte fish. Even those that came from the East Coast were like, we never make it ourselves.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's very impressive. It's rare.
yeah.
By the way, homemade gefilte fish, a good homemade gefilte fish is one of my favorite dishes in the world. Just where do you find it? By the way, the Bagel Restaurant on Broadway near Barry serves delicious homemade gefilte fish. But anyway, it's very rare to find in Chicago.
Or pretty much many other places. By the way, there's a gentleman, I'm not sure, Sunshine, who was asking about a Jewish cookbook. Actually, it's a book he has. They sent me an email earlier today, but I just didn't have time to respond to it. But it's a Jewish cookbook that is from Atlanta. And I'm right now documenting community cookbooks for Highland Park. And I can tell you, you probably want to try to find somebody in Atlanta because those have recipes they grew up on.
Yeah.
So that's your one for
Anyway, this was great. Scott, you
Thank
want
you
to
so much,
turn it,
everybody.
close it up?
Yes, it was, as they say in the home country, this was a mitzvah, your talk tonight. So thank you so much. I'm hungry and I still am going to be making your delicious bagels very soon from your recipe. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from your emails about what other classes you might be teaching in the future. So look forward to seeing you and keep up the great work.
And say goodnight to your children for us.
We will. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye,
everyone.
guys.
Thanks.
Good night.